Welcome to the Deep Dive. You're here because you want to get right to the heart of complex issues without wading through tons of detail. Today, we're diving into something really fundamental, how the state's role is changing in international relations, especially around peace, security, defense, all in this globalized world we live in.
Yeah, and it's a really timely conversation. For this deep dive, we've synthesized a whole bunch of sources looking at everything from power dynamics, historical events, different geopolitical theories.
Right.
The idea is to give you the essentials on states' enduring importance, but also these new challenges it's facing.
Exactly. Our mission really is to pull out the most critical insights. Why is the state still so central? And what are these new kinds of hurdles in our, interconnected world? Okay, so where do we start with this? How do we even begin talking about the state's role?
Well, you must have to start with the bedrock idea, right? The sovereign state. Our sources, they consistently point out that, look, despite globalization, the state is still the main player when it comes to peace and security. Sovereignty is the key concept, this idea of absolute perpetual power. Thinkers like Grotius and Bodin really laid that out.
Absolute, perpetual, and indivisible power, I think was the phrase.
Exactly. But, and this is a key insight from the material, while the state keeps that foundational role, its monopoly on, say, violence and influence, that's definitely eroding. It's not just more actors on the stage, it's that these actors have capabilities that, used to belong only to states. So states are having to adapt, in some pretty big ways. Cyber warfare, managing information, things they never really dealt with before.
That makes sense. So, thinking about state power, what are the building blocks? I saw this acronym DIME pop up in the sources.
Yes, DIME. That's a common way to frame it, especially from a U.S. angle. It stands for diplomacy, information, military, and economy. Those are seen as the traditional tools, the levers of national power.
Okay.
But interestingly, the material also mentioned China's view, which lists diplomatic, economic, and military.
Huh. So, information isn't explicitly listed for China there. Does that mean they, see it differently?
That's a really good question. It doesn't necessarily mean they don't value information. I mean, shaping narratives, managing data, that's crucial for any major power today, right?
Sure.
Maybe their framework just embeds information within diplomacy or economic statecraft. It's sort of implied. And if you look at what we traditionally expect states to do, our sources lay out 5 key functions: governance, internal and external security, economic efficiency, social cohesion, and protecting identities, both individual and collective.
Those sound like the absolute core responsibilities, but this idea of states having all this concentrated power, that wasn't always how it was, right? The sources mentioned a specific historical moment.
Exactly right. The Peace of Westphalia, 1648. That's widely seen as the big turning point. It ended the religious wars in Europe and really cemented the idea of the sovereign state defined territory, right, to rule internally without, outside meddling.
Okay.
But as the sources also point out, that centrality started getting questioned, especially after the Cold War, with globalization really taking off.
So Westphalia sets the stage, the sovereign state is born, basically, and then how these states dealt with each other started to get more formalized. You mentioned the Congress of Vienna.
Yeah, precisely. After Napoleon, you had the Congress of Vienna in 1815, then the Concert of Europe. It was all about trying to create some stability, maintain a balance of power among the big European players: Austria, France, Britain, Prussia, Russia.
Right, the major powers.
And international law at the time, it was all based on sovereignty and independence. That was the rule book. Europe was, pretty much the center of the world back then.
It's easy to forget just how dominant Europe was in the 19th century. But the sources highlight a big shift starting near the end of that century.
Definitely. As the 19th century closed out and the 20th began, you saw powers rising outside Europe, particularly the US and Japan. That started to change the whole global picture. Japan beating Russia in 1905, that was huge. A real sign that things were moving beyond just Europe.
And the rule was non-interference, right? Yep. Keep out of each other's business. At least in theory.
In theory, yes. Non-interference was a cornerstone principle. But then, the 20th century, it brought these incredibly destructive ideologies, didn't it? Nazism in Germany, communism in Russia. They really shook things up.
Yeah, massively.
And think about the U.S. after World War I. They initially pulled back from Europe, which seemed like a step away, but it actually hinted at their growing potential, even then. The German-Soviet pact later on was, Shocking. But ultimately, the Allies won WWII, defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and that just set the stage for the next big clash, the Cold War, the ideological battle.
And that Cold War ended pretty dramatically with the Soviet collapse. What did the sources say were the key reasons for that?
Well, a big one was ideological rigidity. The strict Marxist-Leninist system just couldn't really keep up or adapt to how the world was changing in the late 20th century.
Right.
And economically, technologically, they were falling behind the West. Things like Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, that really put pressure on them. Plus, you could argue the Russian Empire was kind of the last big land empire to fully break apart, way after the Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and Prussian-German ones.
And those collapsing empires left some really tangled legacies, didn't they? The sources talk about ongoing instability in places like the Balkans, the Middle East.
Oh, absolutely. The Balkan problems in the early 20th century, they really foreshadowed a lot of the tensions we still see. And the way the Ottoman Empire was dismantled, that had a huge lasting impact on the Middle East, contributing to conflicts like Cyprus, the Greece-Turkey tensions. It goes on.
Even in Europe itself?
Yeah, even in Europe. The Balkan Wars in the 90s, the Dayton Accords, they show how these deep historical issues just haven't fully gone away.
And it wasn't just European power projection. The sources mention times when their limits became pretty clear. Suez, Indochina, Algeria.
Good point. Suez in 56 is often seen as that moment, right? When Britain and France really saw their old colonial power waning, partly due to nationalism, partly U.S. pressure.
Yeah.
And Indochina, first the French, then the U.S., that showed how hard it was for even major powers to impose their will. Algeria, too. France's brutal war there, ending in independence, was another sign of the times, the strength of anti-colonialism.
The sources also use Vietnam as a powerful example of how colonial history and the Cold War could just get completely intertwined to make things worse.
Yes, Vietnam's a classic case. It started as the Viet Minh fighting French colonial rule, right? But it gradually morphed into this major Cold War battleground. After the Geneva Accords split the country, the U.S. got heavily involved supporting South Vietnam, fearing this domino effect of communism. Meanwhile, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong had Soviet and Chinese backing. It was just this complex mix of, anti-colonial feelings and superpower games playing out.
It really shows how different sides can see the same conflict totally differently, based on their own history and what they want. Which leads us to this key idea in the sources, the perception of security.
This is so important. How a state sees its security interests shapes everything about how it views other countries. Think about the Soviet Union invaded by Napoleon, then Nazi Germany.
Right, from Europe.
Those experiences created this deep-seated fear, this perception of threat from Europe, which definitely influenced how Russia saw NATO expanding later, even after the Cold War.
That history casts such a long shadow. The sources mention this kind of internal debate within Russia, too. Are they culturally Byzantine or European?
Exactly. That's been a theme throughout their history, affecting their identity, their relations East and West. So after the Soviet collapse, when NATO and the EU started expanding eastward, many in Russia saw it through that historical lens, feeling vulnerable, maybe even encircled.
And that perception then directly affects relations with neighbors, like Ukraine.
Undeniably. From the Russian perspective, Ukraine is deeply tied to their own history, going back to Kievan Rus's. For centuries, it was often called Little Russia. So when Ukraine started looking towards the EU, especially around the 2013 protests, Moscow saw it as a major challenge to its influence. That led to the Crimea annexation in 2014, the conflict in the east.
And similarly, Serbia's view on Kosovo is tied so tightly to history, like the Battle of Kosovo.
Yes, exactly. For Serbia, Kosovo is more than just land. It's hugely significant historically, culturally. That battle in the 14th century against the Ottomans is central to their national story. So that historical weight really fuels the strong feelings about Kosovo's independence today.
It's amazing how events from centuries ago still shape security concerns now. The sources even gave an Asian example, China and Japan.
That's right. China losing to Japan in 1895 was a massive shock. It wasn't just a military defeat. It shattered this long-held sense of superiority China had, over island nations, a view held for like 1,000 years. That defeat really changed how China saw Japan from a lesser state to a potential threat.
So the Cold War ends. Maybe there's hope for cooperation, but these deep security perceptions stick around. And the idea of security itself started changing, broadening out, right? The sources talk about that.
Yes, absolutely. The Soviet collapse took away the big superpower nuclear threat, but it sort of uncovered this whole new landscape of risks. The 90s saw this surge in transnational stuff, things beyond typical military threats.
Like what specifically?
Well, international terrorism, WMD proliferation possibly getting into the wrong hands,
Hmm?
organized crime becoming more global, big flows of irregular migration, pandemic suddenly seeming like a real global threat, major environmental disaster.
Things that don't stop at borders.
Exactly. Globalization connects us, sure, but it also seems to amplify these risks. Like Ulrich Beck's idea of the risk society, these large-scale interconnected risks become a defining feature, challenging the state's old ability to just keep threats contained locally. A financial crisis here triggers a global slump. A virus spreads worldwide in weeks.
These feel very current, yeah. And the sources said these new threats blurred the lines between internal and external security.
Precisely. Terrorism, pandemics, they don't care about borders. They start somewhere and can go global fast, so you need a much more integrated security approach. But even with all these new challenges, territory land is still fundamental to what a state is. The sources mentioned border changes, both peaceful and violent.
Right, like German reunification or the Czechoslovakia split being peaceful versus Yugoslavia breaking apart violently.
Exactly. And in Africa, the OAU tried to prevent chaos by sticking to the old colonial borders, mostly, though you had exceptions like Eritrea splitting from Ethiopia. We also saw Yemen unify after conflict, and South Sudan emerge more recently, 2011.
Then 9/11 happened. The sources really framed that as a watershed moment, showing how even the most powerful states were vulnerable to, well, non-state actors.
Absolutely. 9/11 was a stark demonstration. It showed the vulnerability of big states in this globalized age to global terrorism, and also this idea of power diffusing away from just states. The U.S. response showed immense power, of course, but the attacks also drove home the need for international cooperation, intelligence sharing. You couldn't tackle these threats alone.
This diffusion of power idea seems really key. The sources mentioned different ways of thinking about power. Classical realism, neorealism.
Yeah. Classical realism, you often link that with people like Robert Kagan, tends to see power mainly as military muscle, tangible strength. Then you have neorealist ideas, like Paul Kennedy's theory of hegemonic stability.
Hegemonic stability.
The idea that you often need one dominant global power, a hegemon, to keep the international system relatively stable. Think Pax Britannica in the 19th century, Pax Americana after WWII. The period between the world wars is often seen as unstable precisely because there wasn't a clear, willing hegemon.
Okay. And then Joseph Nye's distinction between hard and soft power came up.
Right. Nye's idea. Hard power is coercion, military, economic force. Soft power is influence through attraction, persuasion, cultural appeal, political ideals, policies others admire.
Getting others to want what you want.
Exactly. And Nye argues that in our interconnected world, with power spreading out, soft power is becoming more and more important, even though hard power, especially for the U.S., is still obviously significant.
So given all these changes, power spreading out, security meaning more things, how do the old school geopolitical factors fit in now? Territory, economy.
Well, those fundamentals, territory, economy, population, military, technology, they're still crucial. But the sources really stress how energy resources have become increasingly, sometimes decisively important in geopolitics today. I mean, think back, the Industrial Revolution itself created this global interdependence, largely driven by the hunt for resources.
And we saw that play out in Europe, right? The shifting alliances, the rivalries leading up to World War I.
Precisely. You had Britain trying to maintain a balance of power in the 18th century, then the complex power politics of the 19th century, the concert of Europe trying to keep a lid on things.
But it didn't hold.
No. The rise of a unified, assertive Germany, its Weltpolitik, global policy, created huge tensions, especially with Britain, over naval power. That contributed heavily to the breakdown of the old order.
And this is where those classic geopolitical theories emerged. Ratzel, Mackinder.
Exactly. You had Ratzel thinking of the state almost like an organism needing Lebensraum, living space. Haushofer gave that a more strategic military economic spin. Mackinder's heartland theory, famous idea that controlling Eastern Europe, the heartland, was key to controlling Eurasia, the world island, and thus the world.
And Mahan focused on sea power.
Yes, Alfred Thayer Mahan. He argued sea power was historically the decisive factor for global dominance, controlling trade routes, projecting force. He emphasized strong navies, control of key sea lanes, the importance of coastal states. These ideas were really influential back then.
Leading into WWI, then that messy interwar period, and then the Cold War, which the sources called another kind of armed peace.
Right. A standoff between superpowers, but with conflicts flaring up in other places, third countries. And during the Cold War, Saul Cohen came up with the Shatterbelt
The
concept.
shatter belt.
Yeah, identifying the strategically vital zones stretching from the Middle East through Central Asia to the Caucasus. Hugely important because of oil and gas reserves and just its position as a crossroads between big powers.
And post-Cold War, these geopolitical rivalries continue, but maybe with different players and dynamics.
Yes, definitely. Today's landscape often looks like a rivalry between big continental powers, Russia, China, India, and maritime powers like the US, the EU, Japan. You see key fault lines like in Eurasia, Northwest Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. And energy, access to energy, is still a massive political tool.
And different approaches to things like human rights, too, between those blocks.
That's highlighted as well, yeah. Different views on political pluralism, human rights. And all this is happening within this context of globalization, Beck's Global Risk Society, and the rise of international organizations.
Like the UN, EU, NATO.
UN, EU, NATO, ASEA, but also things like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, often seen as a counterweight in Central Asia, ASEAN, APEC, the African Union, the BRICS group. They all play a bigger role now. There's even a suggestion the Pacific might become the world's central hub, with the Atlantic maybe becoming a bit more peripheral. And while Asia still seems focused on traditional power balances, Europe's arguably trying to move towards a more integrated multinational system.
Okay, so bringing it all together, what are the big contemporary risks and threats highlighted in this complex picture?
Well, it's like a lot of the new risks from the 90s are still very much with us, maybe even intensified. Transnational terrorism, WMD proliferation worries, fragile states causing instability, regional crises, rapid tech changes in weapons, drug trafficking, organized crime.
So old threats in new forms, amplified by globalization.
Pretty much. They add this negative side to being so interconnected. But interestingly, the sources suggest these global risks have paradoxically kind of pushed the state back into its traditional security role.
How's
Because when threats cross borders so easily, the state's basic job protecting its people becomes even more vital. Plus, we're dealing with these other big visible things. Pandemics, major environmental disasters, huge refugee flows. And the worry about different threats combining like terrorism and WMDs, that's a major concern.
And it all interconnects.
Exactly. Climate change, cyber attacks, energy politics, water scarcity, they're all linked. And the nature of conflict keeps changing too. Lots of asymmetric warfare. It's often messy, not clear winners and losers, though traditional interstate war sadly hasn't disappeared.
Like the Russo-Georgian War.
Yeah, 2008. That mixed old-school geopolitics balance of power in the Caucasus with newer stuff, like fighting over energy pipeline routes. And of course, the Russo-Ukrainian war has had massive global consequences, especially for energy security.
So let's wrap this deep dive up. What are the absolute key takeaways listeners should hold on to about the state's evolving role?
Okay, I think. 1, the state is still central, even with non-state actors gaining influence. 2, security means way more than just military defense now. It includes all these transnational threats. 3, those geopolitical ideas, balance of power, continental versus maritime, they still help us understand what's going on.
Right.
4, power has definitely diffused since the Cold War ended, with the U.S. navigating a world with other major players like China. And 5, energy. Access to energy, control of energy. That's become a critical, often explosive factor in global competition and security.
So it's clear the old state system isn't vanishing. It's adapting, maybe struggling sometimes, but adapting to this globalized world with all its new threats and power shifts. So thinking about all that, this complex dance between the state's enduring power and these new global challenges, what do you think might define international security in the next few decades? What kinds of cooperation or maybe conflict could emerge from all this? Definitely something to keep thinking about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.